Hi everybody, welcome and thanks very much for coming out on this glorious Brisbane summer day. Thank you also to Queensland Health and particularly Dovetail for hosting us here today. I hope that those of you who are logged in remotely can hear and see well. Can I ask that for your remote questions, please send them in throughout the presentation. We will answer them all together at the end, but please keep sending them through, they will be saved. So I wanted to talk a little bit today about the drug trends research. This is an annual program of research that we have that collects immediate information about the patterns of use, particularly of substances, and we're focusing today on this year's Queensland findings. So what does it do? It provides information about Australia's drug markets and the trends in drug-related harms that we see. And we use it to enhance the evidence base that will help eventually develop policy responses and interventions. And what this does that nothing else does is it provides a very timely warning system for issues that require further monitoring. So the Drug Trends program comprises two parts. The first is the Ecstasy and Related Drugs Reporting System, and the other is the Illicit Drugs Reporting System, which focuses on people who inject drugs. So the research program is funded by the Australian Government Department of Health under the Drug and Alcohol program, and the work is undertaken nationally by a collaborative which is centrally based at the National Drug and Alcohol Research Centre, or NDARC, at UNSW. So the partner universities are here on the stage. In Queensland, it's us at the University of Queensland. We work with Burnet Institute in Victoria, University of Tasmania, the National Drug Research Institute at Curtin University in Western Australia, and a group in the Northern Territory, and of course our team at NDARC. In Queensland, we have a team who coordinate and do all of the interviews. So I'd like to acknowledge the work of Catherine, Camilla, Emmy, Megan and Sean, and Leith, who is here as well today. And we particularly need to acknowledge our recruiting support, which is done through Biala and Quinn here in Queensland for the injectors study. So what are these two studies? The EDRS happens every year. Between April and June, we interview 100 people who regularly and currently use ecstasy or other psychoactive substances. We pick our people from Brisbane and the Gold Coast. As it's done in every state, we are focused on the capital cities, but because Queensland is a little bit different and the southeast corner is very much different from the rest of the state, we include the Gold Coast and at times the Sunshine Coast as well. So we recruit our people from advertising through social media and word of mouth. In IDRS, we speak to 100 people who inject drugs, and we do that between May and July. And again, our people come from Brisbane and the Gold Coast, and this recruiting is very much more service-based around the needle and syringe programs, as well as word of mouth. So our information comes from all of our key people on the ground who are involved in the use, the trading of substances, so we interview them. We also do interviews with a number of key experts over our time, and they're people who work in health, in law enforcement, in the entertainment industry, in event management. And then we look at existing indicator data that might come from health services, from the law enforcement themselves, from some of the forensics units, and we triangulate that information to give us a global picture of what's happening in the trends for the drug use, the markets, and the related issues. We look at consumption patterns, we look at the markets, we look at health-related trends, we look at particularly risky behaviours, law enforcement trends, and each year we will have some special topics. So we've been looking at internet purchasing for a little while now, particularly in the EDRS, and in the IDRS we're looking at hepatitis C testing and therapy, and issues around discrimination of people who people who inject drugs particularly. So obviously there are some limitations to this study. We can't say that the people that we talk to are representative of all people or all substance users, particularly as our information is very much focused on the southeast corner of Queensland. We can't draw any causal links either because we're collecting data at a single point in time each year, but because we have tight time frame indicators where we ask people what they've been doing over the last 6 months and a month and even in the last week and day, and the fact that we can track trends over time in what happens in a group of people who have quite similar characteristics, And then we look at the other data sources to see whether these things can give us confidence in our information. We also look at what's different between the different states. Some things are fairly constant. It's amazing how different the different areas might be, though. So I'm going to jump in now and talk a little bit about the groups of people that we talked to this year. You can see the EDRS, who are the Ecstasy cohort, are much younger than the IDRS. The injectors tend to be around the age of 40, and they tend to be getting older each year that we interview. The people in EDRS are most likely to be male, single, and combination of work and study around that age. In the IDRS, they're also male and single, but quite often unemployed. We don't see a huge number of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the EDRS section, but in the IDRS we find that they're overrepresented in comparison with the Australian population. The EDRS group have mostly finished Year 12, very few of the IDRS have. Prison history, very low in one and quite high in the other. And treatment seeking is fairly low in those who use the ecstasy and related drugs, whereas at least half of our IDRS sample are currently in treatment of some type. What is constant, though, is that both groups use regularly. So nearly half of our EDRS sample are using at least weekly. The IDRS are more likely to be using weekly and up to daily. So what do they use? We asked them what would their drug of choice be. So everything lined up on the bar, what would you head for if price was no barrier? And you can see that they're really quite different. The EDRS group, generally ecstasy is their drug of choice, but there's a lot of cannabis that's favoured. They will say that they would like to be using cocaine. They also like acid. And you do see a little bit of ice as a preferred drug, but not very often. Whereas the IDRS group, heroin is overwhelmingly the drug of choice and has been for a long time. But those who are nominating that they actually prefer to use ice have been creeping up over the years. They also nominate that they would prefer to be using speed if it was available. The IDRS group use quite a lot of cannabis, but it's not their drug of choice. If you then ask them what they actually use most often in the last month, these things are a little bit different. So the ecstasy use in the EDRS group is pretty much the same, but they use an awful lot more cannabis as a regular thing. They drink a lot of alcohol and quite regularly. They don't use very much ice, and they don't use cocaine as often as they would obviously like to. With the IDRS, although the heroin is their drug of choice, a lot more of them are using ice on a regular basis. They also use morphine and a lot of other opioids, and not so much alcohol. So if we look in a little bit more depth of what's happening with the ecstasy using group, so there's a lot of numbers here. What we can see here that's really quite interesting, that's different from last year, is that the forms of MDMA that people are using changes regularly depending on what's out there. So we're seeing this year that 3/4 of them are using pills on a regular basis again. And that number had dropped quite considerably over the last few years because the purity had dropped and people were turning to capsules and crystal instead because they believed that those were more pure. But if we look here, we can see that a fairly good proportion of them think that the pills that they're using are of medium or high strength and that they're very, very readily available still. Oddly enough, the median price of a pill hasn't changed in as long as I've been involved in this study. So we're looking at 10 to 12 years. So it's stayed very constant. It's cheaper in Queensland to buy pills than it is in any of the other states because the median price nationally is about 25. Powder was something that people started turning to when they thought that the pill quality was very low, but the uptake hasn't been very high. People instead have gone on to capsules and crystal. But they've dropped off a little bit when people return to the pills. That might have something to do with the price of the crystal because it's up higher, but they certainly are still telling us that the purity is still high, or they believe the purity is much higher for the crystal. Cocaine's the other interesting one. 60% of people said that they'd used it recently. That's much higher than we've seen in previous years. We think that that's because it's more available And people are saying that the quality or the purity is higher than they've seen in previous years as well. The other thing that's interesting in this group that's really quite different to the group who inject drugs is that their use of crystal methamphetamine is a lot lower. So only 12% of them had used it in recent months, compared to a lot in the IDRS group. And although it is still relatively inexpensive, it's not an experience generally that people tell us that they're keen on. The other things about this group that are interesting is that polysubstance use is very common. Generally, they'll be using MDMA in combination with a number of other substances at the same time, typically cannabis, tobacco, alcohol, but also LSD and cocaine. They also have binges quite regularly, which we define as being using for 48 hours at least without sleeping. So I think our record for a binge in this year's was 10 days solid. Which requires an awful lot of substances and probably a lot of sleeping off afterwards. The use of novel psychoactive substances was expected to be really quite high with this group when we started monitoring them a few years ago. As the quality of MDMA went down and as some of the other substances that people had used became harder to get, we thought that they'd be looking for the analogues to try and get around the legal situation. What tended to happen was that people would try things and then give them away as not quite the experience they were after. But we do find that they still use a couple of them regularly. So DMT is the most commonly used, followed by 2CB and some herbal highs. So just to give you an idea of how often that's happening, so 16% of our group said they'd used DMT recently. That's often associated with festivals. 2CB, 14%, the herbal high is only 7%, but that's a lot higher than any of the other synthetic substances that we ask about. The synthetic marijuana that was around for quite some time is not used often at all in this group. We have heard that it's used in other groups in other parts of Queensland, but not the people that we're talking to. Other interesting ones, we see people coming unstuck in the treatment services from using N-bone. This group don't tend to go out looking for it. We know from the forensic testing that a lot of the pills are contaminated with it, but only 3% of our people said that they went out to actually use it quite determinedly. The other interesting one this year was mescaline, because we asked people if they've used things in Australia. So we had 4 people who said that they had actually bought and used it here. Normally you only see that overseas. When we look at some of the other substances that they've been using, LSD is really high. So that's both higher than the national average and an increase on last year's. We know this group tend to like their psychedelics, but that is much higher than we have seen in the past. The 60% cocaine is also really high, but it's about the same as the other states, whereas we had seen lower use in Queensland because of the availability. Ketamine's jumped up again this year. And so has amyl nitrate and nitrous. So those things are generally seen to go around in cycles. Amyl nitrate was up a couple of years ago, then it dropped right down again. The ketamine obviously is a worry because of the dose response issues, but this group seemed to have been using quite a fair bit. The nitrous oxide is often more associated with a younger age group, but this group somewhat guiltily said that yes, there has been a lot about. The other ones that are different to what's happening in the national study is the prescription opioids are up, so higher here in Queensland, and benzos as well. So they're things for us to be watching for, particularly in the treatment services. The high-dose codeine is about what it has been in the last couple of years. Now that's interesting because of the rescheduling that's happened. We thought that that might go down. We also asked people a little bit about whether they've been stockpiling because of the change in its legal status, but nobody mentioned anything about it. So, and again, the use of the novel psychoactive substances is down from previous. People tend not to be interested. So if we talk about heroin now, we're going to be looking at the information that comes out of the IDRS. So if we look at what's happening in the different states, we'll see that the use in Queensland is much lower than New South Wales and Victoria and the ACT, but higher than the Territory and South Australia. So this is people who are using on a regular basis over the last 6 months. The Queensland use of heroin's been drifting down slowly over the last 15, 16 years. Nothing dramatic, but we think it's linked to the availability and the purity. The purity in Queensland is generally rated much lower than what is rated by the people, particularly in New South Wales and Victoria. What we found in the other states is that WA, New South Wales and Victoria, the proportion who use heroin is pretty much the same as those who use ice. But in the Territory, in South Australia, Tasmania, ACT and Queensland, ice use has overtaken the number of people who use heroin regularly. So if we then start looking at the numbers about the price, the purity and the availability as it's perceived by our people, so just to reinforce that the strength issue here is how people perceive what they're consuming is, rather than anything that's based on empirical knowledge. So 45% of our group had used heroin recently. You can contrast that with what they're doing as far as methamphetamine goes, 72%. The price is still relatively high, and in fact the price in Queensland is much higher than in some of the other states. So, for example, the national price for a gram of heroin was about $280, so considerably more in Queensland. And the purity, the strength is rated as medium, certainly not high, but it's still rated as fairly easy to get hold of. Quite a lot of people are using methadone, and at least half of them are injecting it. Subutex, less use than we've seen in the past, and Suboxone more. So the numbers in the brackets are the people who are using it not prescribed, so either illicitly procured or not using it as it's been prescribed for them. The prices for those haven't gone up or down very much over the last few years. We thought with the rescheduling of oxycodone, for example, that the price of that would go right down because it was harder for people to inject. But in fact, we still see about a quarter of our group who are injecting it anyway, and they're paying pretty much the same amount for the pills. Fentanyl is something that goes up and down. We had a big rash of it a couple of years ago, and that was linked to some fatalities and a lot of near misses. So the use went right down last year, but it's crept up again a little bit here. We're seeing a lot of Lyrica this year. So we saw it also in the EDRS group. We don't have information on the price and the availability of it, but considering the number of people who are using it, it must be out there. What's interesting is the price of crystal methamphetamine. So heroin, the crystal meth price is about the same as it is for the people who are in the Ecstasy group. So a few years back, we were seeing that people in the Ecstasy group were paying a lot more for crystal meth than those who were in the IDRS group. We don't know whether that was because they have more regular contact with dealers or whether they were going third party, but the prices converged. It's still higher than it is in the other states. It's about $210 a gram across some of the other states, but people are still out there and getting hold of it. So if we look a little bit more specifically at crystal, you can see that the use is high across all of the states. So you've got two sets of numbers there. The blue ones are used by the injecting group, and the orange ones or the red ones are the group from the EDRS, the Ecstasy using group. You can see that in Queensland, not many of our Ecstasy using group use it. It's higher in some of the other states, particularly South Australia. And what we find is that that's mostly crystal. There is a little bit of speed about in the southern states, but it's mostly crystal across the board. So what happens for these people? We ask them about a number of health issues that might be related to their substance use. I was quite surprised this year to see, we asked them, have they experienced any mental health problems in the last 6 months, whether or not they've seen a professional about that. And so that's the first item there. Half of our EDRS group are experiencing mental health problems, and half of those have actually received a prescription for it, which means they have engaged with a professional recently. That's higher than we have seen in the past. It was around 35 to 40% in the last few years, so that's moving up. The IDRS group, we have more expectations that there will be mental health problems associated with longer term use. So those numbers weren't really much of a surprise. We also do the Kessler 10 with these people just to check on the symptoms, and again, much higher this year in the EDRS group than we've seen in the past. So this is a score cutoff that indicates quite high levels of distress, not moderate but high. We asked them about their dependence on different substances. So very few of the EDRS group are showing any signs of dependence on ecstasy. And in fact, fewer than before have shown signs of dependence on the methamphetamine where they use it. We see much more dependent use in the IDRS group, but even that's lower than last year. It's around 50% last year. And as expected, most of our IDRS group show dependence on opioids. The other one that I found interesting is the audit. So this is looking at their alcohol use, and this is a cutoff that we've used where people would be suggesting not just some advice on their drinking, but actual interventions and then lots of concerted follow-up. So a quarter of our EDRS group, so this is young people who are generally between 20 and 30, most of them working and studying, are drinking at levels which would put them under the very close scrutiny of a clinician. Less so in our IDRS group. Most of those have much, much lower scores for the audit. The binge that is being referred to there is again the use for over 48 hours, but I was interested to see that we had, a lot of binging in the IDRS group as well. That tended to be methamphetamine rather than use of heroin day. And it's the depressants generally that cause the overdoses. A lot of people don't really get the concept of overdosing on stimulants. A lot of the EDRS group particularly don't recognise that they might have had an overdose. So again, only a very few of them reported having had that, but you've got 15% of them who've had depressant overdoses in the last 6 months. We look at some justice issues as well. So as I said earlier, a lot of the IDRS group have been in prison over their lifetime, and quite a few have been arrested in the last 12 months. That's often related to issues around procuring substances, whether it's break and entry or selling, but it's also occasionally some violent crimes. So this is what I found interesting. We tend to think stereotypically that our EDRS group are fairly free of most harms, but over half of them copped to being involved in crime in the last month. Now, the majority of that is dealing, but again, in the past, they haven't thought of what they were doing when they were selling drugs as dealing. They buy a few extra for friends, but I think a lot more of them are engaged in doing that on a broader basis now. So dealing is the prime crime in which they've admitted to being involved, but there's also some property crime, and that's more what we would have expected for the IDRS group. Driving is the other issue. So over 1 in 10 of our group of the EDRS have driven, and this is recently in a lot of cases. Very few of our IDRS group, because not so many of them actually drink, but both groups drive after using other substances, and we're talking about in the 3 hours following your initial dose. So we've been hearing a lot about that, and it's obviously going to come to the attention of the justice services. So that is the formal part of the presentation over for today. I've thrown an awful lot of numbers out there. Normally, in past years, we have produced a fairly hefty report for each of the EDRS and the IDRS studies, at least 70 pages, 50 million graphs and tables. It's very intensive to produce, and we suspect that a lot of it goes unread. So what we would really like to know from the people who are tuning in or here today is, what information do you want to know on a regular basis? What would you like us to tell you about the enormous amount of information that we've collected from these people this year? What would you like us to ask about next year? Are there hot topics that are burning up your service that you would like to see us scan our populations through? Please let us know, because we have opportunities to build in extra questions about particular topics each year, and we can that way get data from not just Queensland but compare it to the other states. The other really important thing is, how do you want to hear from us? Traditionally, we have sent out the reports as soon as they've been prepared, and because they're enormous, they take a little bit longer. We've got these results out to you within 3 months of having collected the information, which is a massive piece of work. The big reports often sit on shelves or on cyber shelves these days because we don't print them. We have also sent out up to 6 bulletins a year, which are generally 1 or 2 pages on a specific topic, and it's just bite-sized information. People have responded pretty well to that, but again, we really want to know what sort of things that you would like us to do, rather than waiting for us to get curious about something. Please tell us what you're interested in so that we can ask the data and send that information. So please feel free to follow up with sending information in today. My email address is coming up. But we will also send out to this mailing list a survey which asks these questions again, so that we can hopefully gather some more information. So, do you have any questions now? And for those of you who are recording, that's my contact details here. Please do feel free to email me. If you have questions about the national program, Amy Peacock's the national program lead, but if it's Queensland, come to me. Ben, do you have any questions come through? No. That's desperately quiet. Surely somebody out there has something they want to ask. No? Well, in that case, thank you very much all for coming.
I have a question.
Oh, yay!
Hey. I was just wondering, when you were talking about the EDRS group,
yeah,
and talking to them about overdose,
yes,
do you just ask the question, have you had an overdose on ecstasy or MDMA or whatever, or does a description get given? This is what an MDMA-related overdose looks like. Has that ever happened to you?
Yeah. We do give them some descriptions of typical symptoms when you're experiencing an overdose. We ask them if they've ever had one, and then in the last 12 months, and how long ago the last one was. And then we ask them which substances were involved, and then whether or not they've sought any help. So if you wanted more information, we can certainly dig into that for you, but I didn't present all of it today. So yeah, if there's something that you'd like to know, please, yeah, let us know. And so we ask that about stimulant use and then about depressant use as well. And then particularly with the IDRS group, we've been asking them more about their experiences there and whether or not they've engaged with the various naloxone programs. So whether they know what naloxone is, whether they've taken up the earlier programs where you could go and do training and then get a prescription for naloxone, and then how much they've heard about the new rescheduling of naloxone so that they can go and buy it over the counter and have it stockpiled. So last year there were very few people who knew about the rescheduling, a few more this year, so we have hopes that the uptake of that will be greater.
Do you know what the numbers are?
Off the top of my head, no, sorry.
Yeah, no, because I just found from the interviews I did, most people still didn't have a clue.
It seemed to vary a little bit from location to location. I know in New South Wales and Victoria they've had very high recognition of the naloxone programs, but ours has sort of been creeping up at a lower level, but they're increasing, so it's going in the right direction. We also ask them questions about Hep C, and we've noticed that there has been greater engagement in the Hep C testing over the last couple of years, particularly as the NSPs have been pushing out programs to encourage people to not only have antibody tests, but to go and get PCR tests for active virus, and then encouraging them to join the treatment programs through the NSPs. So that has been going up as well, which is really exciting to see. So that's been a very effective way of going about it. Oh, off the top of my head, no. But I can let you know, certainly, yeah. Yeah. I can have a look and let you know what Queensland versus the other states has been. But certainly the approach of going out through the NSPs has been quite effective, and it's been used in a few places overseas as well. Yeah.
question from the webinar, why the meth use is different between EDRS and IDRS.
It's been different all the way along since we've started using it. So the question was, why is the meth use different between EDRS and IDRS? The attitudes towards it are quite different. There is still a high level of stigma attached to methamphetamine use in both groups. And in fact, in the IDRS, those who are heroin purists can be quite negative about those who use methamphetamine. But with that injecting group, it's often a case of what's about and what they can get their hands on easily. With the EDRS group, the stigma is really quite overt, so very negative stereotyping around crystal methamphetamine use, and they have a different perception of speed use as being less harmful, but there is very little speed that's available on the market at the moment. So yeah, social norming is working a treat with that group.
Another question. I'll just check if I see it.
Okay. Okay, so question is, apart from drug supply to associates as a criminal activity, what other criminal activities do the user group mention? They mention the supply, obviously. There are some property crime as well, which I think I put up. Can I flick the slides back? Yes, I can. Okay. So property crime, you can see there, whoops, okay, a quarter of them have been involved in property crime over the last month. There is less involvement with that group in violent crime, and very little fraud is the other one that we ask them about. So the majority is the dealing in property crime. Anybody else? Come on, you're getting warmed up here, I can tell. You're welcome. Okay. If you have any further questions that you think of later on, burning questions that appear to you later, please feel free to email me. If it's not something that's in the presentation, I can certainly have a look at the data and let you know. So I'm really happy to do that. Otherwise, thanks very much again for coming out on a lousy day or for tuning in electronically as you've done.